Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here to debate this most important of questions, and it's an honour to be sharing the stage with perhaps the world's foremost apologist for Christian theism. I've followed and admired Dr. Craig's work for several years now, and I'm looking forward to what I'm sure is going to be a vigorous exchange of ideas. I'd like to begin by saying something about why I'm here. I'm an atheist, and tonight I'll be arguing for atheism, but I'm not a committed atheist, and nor am I what's sometimes called an anti-theist, that is, someone who thinks not only is theism false, but positively harmful. I'm not a committed theist nor an anti-theist, because I don't regard atheism as a position that I'm particularly invested in, or as a position that I particularly want to hold or for other people to hold. On the contrary, I'd quite like to believe some version of theism. And there are quite a few other supernatural claims that I'd like to believe as well. For example, I'd particularly like to believe that I'll come back to life after my bodily death. In fact, I often find myself rather envying religious believers, and how wonderful it must be to sincerely believe that the universe is governed by an all-powerful, all-good creator, and most wonderful of all, that after death we're reunited for eternity with our loved ones. So being someone who would actually rather like to agree with Dr. Craig, I'm not here tonight because I have a desire to convince religious believers that they're wrong, even though I think they are. And I certainly have no expectation that at the end of tonight's debate, any religious believers in the audience, after hearing my arguments for atheism, are going to go home saying, "Silly me, God doesn't exist after all." Nor do I even have any real desire to be proved right. On the contrary, I'd actually rather like to be proved wrong. And it's because I quite like theism to be true, I suppose, that at various points in my life I've actively, and I think sincerely, tried to cultivate some form of religious belief. But despite my best efforts, despite being intellectually open to theism, despite a considerable amount of honest reflection on the various arguments for the existence of God, and despite, as I say, having a strong desire for theism to be true, I'm sorry to say that I've never found any of the arguments persuasive or had any kind of religious experience of the sort that might lead me to embrace some form of theism. Now these psychological facts about me, that I'm open to theism, that I fairly consider the evidence in its favour, and yet that I persist in a state of unbelief, actually suggest a rather simple but I think quite powerful argument for atheism. Why the cosmic game of hide and seek? Why would a loving God, who supposedly wants all human beings to enter into a personal relationship with him, remain hidden from someone who sincerely seeks him? If such a being exists, then surely you'd expect there to be no non-believers like me. That is, non-believers who, in John Schellenberg's words, are non-resistant to religious belief and indeed have actively striven to cultivate it. Now, if that's right, then the fact that there are non-resistant non-believers like me constitutes good evidence for the non-existence of such a being. Now, of course, Dr. Craig might say that I can't have been sincere in my efforts to cultivate belief. But he really has no non-question begging reason to back those sorts of claims up. And by that I mean that the only way he could reasonably deny that I'm in a state of non-resistant non-belief would be to beg the question by assuming from the outset that God exists, and that since God's existence is incompatible with the existence of non-resistant non-believers, it must be the case that all non-belief is actually resistant non-belief. Now, I think it would be reasonable to suppose that some non-believers are resistant to religious belief, and so whether consciously or unconsciously hide from themselves the reasons that might be adduced in support of religious belief. But Dr. Craig would need to make the much stronger claim that all non-believers, including those like me who claim to be open to theism, are in fact in a state of rebellion, that is, as having consciously or unconsciously chosen to close the door on the possibility of a relationship with God. Now, I think that would be an implausibly strong claim for which there's no non-question begging evidence. The fact is that there are lots of people like me who claim to be open to theism but are nonetheless non-believers. And I can think of no reason why we shouldn't take the testimony of non-resistant non-believers on face value. Alternatively, Dr. Craig might say that I haven't properly engaged with the arguments, or as he undoubtedly would claim, that I've made a mistake in my assessment of them. Dr. Craig obviously thinks that there are numerous sound arguments for God's existence, and since he regards those arguments as sound, he must think that anyone who's unpersuaded by them has made some kind of rational mistake. They must be rationally dysfunctional in some way. But as Dr. Craig himself is well aware, it's not only through the provision of external evidence and argument that God could make himself known to the non-resistant non-believer. As an omnipotent being, it would be an absolute cinch for him to provide me with direct experiential knowledge of his reality. And yet he chooses not to do so. So one of the things that I'd like to hear from Dr. Craig tonight is a plausible, non-question begging explanation as to why God hasn't revealed himself to me and others like me. Now, Dr. Craig might say that while there are non-resistant non-believers like me, it's only a matter of time before God reveals himself. So in his podcast, Dr. Craig's podcast, not God's podcast, he's argued that the kind of non-resistant non-belief that I ascribe to myself is not incompatible with the existence of God. What is incompatible with the existence of God is what he calls persistent non-resistant non-belief. That is, non-resistant belief that persists until death. So in Dr. Craig's view, if my characterization of my non-belief as non-resistant is accurate, then at some point prior to my death, God will reveal himself to me. Now my response to this would simply be to ask Dr. Craig, why hasn't God already revealed himself to me? And surely given God's perfectly loving nature, and given that my coming into a personal relationship with God is supposedly the greatest good for me, you'd expect God, as an all-powerful, all-loving being, not to delay in delivering that great good to me. What would we think of a parent who said, I'm not going to have anything to do with my child for the first 40 years of his life? Well, we'd obviously be inclined to say that they fell short as a parent and that their love for their child was imperfect. So in other words, I think that Dr. Craig's attempt to sidestep the problem posed by non-resistant non-belief, but by saying that while temporary non-resistant non-belief is compatible with theism, persistent non-resistant non-belief is not compatible with theism, does nothing to mitigate the problem, since any kind of non-resistant non-belief, whether temporary or persistent, is incompatible with the existence of an omnipotent, perfectly loving being. Okay, I'd now like to say something about the argument from evil and why I think it provides good reasons for believing atheism to be true. Now, the argument from evil is, of course, an ancient argument, so I make no claim to originality here. In its simplest form, it asserts that since God is omnipotent and morally perfect, he should be both able and willing to prevent evil. Since there is evil in the world, such a being cannot or is unlikely to exist. Now, one of the traditional theistic responses to this sort of argument is to claim that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil to occur, because evil is necessary for the existence of what are called outweighing goods. For example, courage, which we value, is only possible in a situation in which there is fear. Sympathy, which we value, is only possible in a situation in which there is suffering. Dignity in the face of adversity is only possible in a situation in which there is suffering. Now, I've never found this kind of response very persuasive, primarily because it's just highly implausible that the so-called outweighing goods really do outweigh the evils that make them possible. I mean, are we really supposed to believe that the evil of a small child dying of leukemia is outweighed by the sympathy that's expressed to the grieving parents, or by the fact that the parents are brought closer together by their shared suffering? Now, Dr. Craig might say that this is an emotional, not an intellectual reaction to such evils, but it seems to me that the strong emotional reaction such events or occurrences elicit is telling us something, that our emotions are in effect functioning cognitively here, and that this is exactly the kind of feature of our moral experience that Dr. Craig appeals to in the context of his moral argument when he says that we apprehend objective moral values in moral experience. That is, that we just see immediately that something is good or evil. But even if you think these evils really do outweigh the evils which make them possible, you're still going to be left with the problem of accounting for all the evil in the world that can't plausibly be said to be necessary for the achievement of some outweighing good. That's to say, there's plenty of evil in the world that appears to be entirely pointless or gratuitous. Let's say that an evil is pointless if and only if God lacks a morally sufficient reason for allowing it to occur. And let's say further that God lacks a morally sufficient reason for allowing an evil to occur, even only if he could have prevented it without thereby losing out on some outweighing good or preventing some equally bad or worse evil. So examples of pointless evil are an animal's dying an agonizing death in a forest fire, a baby that's born with a terminal illness that endures intense suffering and then dies after only a few days of life, a tsunami that wipes out many thousands of people like the one that struck Southeast Asia on Boxing Day 2004 and killed in excess of 230,000. There's a profusion of apparently pointless evil in the world, from which, as I now want to claim, it follows that God probably does not exist. This argument, the argument from pointless evil, can be stated as follows. Premise 1, necessarily, if God exists, there are no pointless evils. Premise 2, probably there are pointless evils. Therefore, conclusion, probably God does not exist. As an instance of modus tollens, this is a logically valid argument. That's to say, the conclusion follows from the premises. Whether the conclusion is true, therefore, hinges on the truth of the premises. Now, the truth of premise 1 follows a priori from God's omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection. If God exists, then since he's morally perfect, he wouldn't act or fail to act unless he has a morally sufficient reason for doing so. And since he's omnipotent and omniscient, he'd be able to prevent any evil which isn't necessary for the achievement of an outweighing good or the avoidance of an equally bad or worse evil. It follows that if an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being exists, there are no pointless evils. What about the second premise? Do pointless evils really exist? Well, the first thing I want to say about this premise is that it's meant to be a probabilistic claim. That's to say, I'm not claiming that we can know with certainty of any instance of apparently pointless evil that it really is pointless. That's because with respect to any instance of apparently pointless evil, it's always going to be possible to say that it's logically possible that that instance of apparently pointless suffering was in fact, contrary to appearances, necessary for the achievement of some outweighing good, of which we're unaware. Some outweighing goods are easily identifiable for us. So, for example, the good of health that is achieved through some painful medical procedure. But it might be the case that the outweighing goods of which we're aware are not exhaustive of the outweighing goods that there are. Perhaps there are outweighing goods that are entirely cognitively inaccessible to us. And perhaps what appear to us to be pointless evils are in fact necessary for those outweighing goods of which we're unaware. And this response would be fine to the logical argument from evil, which claims that God and evil are logically incompatible. The mere logical possibility that what appear to us to be pointless evils are in fact necessary for the achievement of outweighing goods of which we're unaware is enough to show that God and evil are logically compatible. But I'm not claiming that God and evil are logically incompatible. I'm claiming that the existence of what appear to us to be pointless evils means that God probably doesn't exist. And the conclusion that God probably doesn't exist is probabilistic precisely because the claim that pointless evils exist is probabilistic. So I'm not claiming that we can know with certainty that there are pointless evils. I'm only claiming that we can know that it's probably the case that there are pointless evils. And that, in conjunction with the truth of premise 1, is enough to establish the conclusion that God probably doesn't exist. So, what reasons are there for regarding premise 2 as true? Well, first, there's the fact that it appears to us that certain evils are pointless. That's to say, there are evils for which, even after very careful consideration, we can't discern any morally sufficient reason why God would allow them. Now, Dr. Craig standardly responds to this line of argument by claiming that human cognitive faculties are just too limited for us to be able to reasonably expect that we'd be able to fathom God's morally sufficient reasons for allowing apparently pointless suffering. Given the vast distance between the human mind and God's mind, it just isn't reasonable to suppose that if God had a morally sufficient reason for permitting apparently pointless suffering, we'd be able to detect it. The fact that we can't detect God's morally sufficient reason only counts as a good reason for believing that God lacks such reasons if we have good reason for thinking we'd be able to detect his morally sufficient reason if he had one. And according to Dr. Craig, we don't have good reason for thinking we'd be able to detect God's morally sufficient reason if he had one. Now, at this point in his argument, Dr. Craig likes to invoke an analogy with chaos theory. Just as a butterfly flapping its wings in West Africa can set in motion a causal chain that leads to a hurricane over the Atlantic, so too, quote, the brutal murder of an innocent man or a child dying of leukemia could produce a sort of ripple effect through history, such that God's morally sufficient reason for permitting it might not emerge until centuries later and perhaps in another land. When you think of God's providence over the whole of history, I think you can see how hopeless it is for limited observers to speculate on the probability that God could have a morally sufficient reason for permitting a certain evil. We're just not in a good position to assess such probabilities. Now, it's true that a child dying of leukemia might have a ripple effect, and it's also true that we're not in a good position to assess such probabilities. But obviously that cuts both ways. For all we know, the child dying of leukemia has no morally significant ripple effect. Or it might have a ripple effect that leads not to some outweighing good, but to further evil, perhaps even to a greater evil. Or it might lead to a ripple effect that has some good consequences, but not enough to constitute an outweighing good. So, putting this a bit more formally, we can say that assuming that all events have a ripple effect, in respect of any instance of apparently pointless evil E, one of the following four propositions must be true. 1, E has a ripple effect leading to an outweighing good or the prevention of an equally bad or worse evil. 2, E has a ripple effect leading to a non-outweighing good. 3, E has a ripple effect leading to further evil. And 4, E has a ripple effect that is morally neutral. Now note that of these four possibilities, we can say that E is not a pointless evil if and only if 1 is true. So unless 1 is true, E is a pointless evil. Now, since by Dr. Craig's own admission we're not in a position to assess the probabilities, it follows that 1 to 4 are equiprobable propositions. That is, each of the four possibilities has a probability of 1/4. Now, as I said, E is not a pointless evil if and only if 1 is true, from which it follows that the probability that E is not a pointless evil is 1/4, and the probability that E is a pointless evil is 3/4. Therefore, it's more probable than not that E is a pointless evil, therefore probably God does not exist. That completes my positive case for atheism. Obviously, I haven't said anything yet in response to Dr. Craig's own arguments, but I'll explain why I don't think any of them is successful in the first and second rebuttals. In Dr. Craig's rebuttal, as I said, I'm hoping that he'll be able to provide me with a non-question begging explanation of why God doesn't reveal himself to me as a non-resistant non-believer. I'm also hoping to hear from Dr. Craig in his response to my argument from pointless evil, how, given his view that we're ignorant of the relevant probabilities of the ripple effects of apparently pointless evil, he thinks he can avoid the implication of that view that with respect to any instance of apparently pointless evil, it's more probable than not that it's not just an apparently pointless evil, but an actually pointless evil, from which, as I've argued, it follows that God probably doesn't exist. Thank you very much.